Remember Lucas, the eminent writer who started one of his workshops with the question, "What is a story?" This was way back in the lesson when we laid out our target. Good fiction is an interesting cognitive simulation of a dynamic story world that entertains, instructs, or explores the nature of the human condition. Well, I remember one moment in Lucas's workshop vividly, not so much because it was a seminal moment for me or my writing, but because it was for someone else. One of my colleagues, a very talented novelist who'd been a creative writing major as an undergrad, had a bit of an epiphany in Lucas's workshop. Lucas was talking about narrators, and talking about them in the way creative writers often do, which is to say imprecisely. He said something along the lines of, "You have to think about who your narrator is. Even if it's a third-person narrator, you still have to know who's telling your story." Roe was grumbling internally because third-person narrator. Well, that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, along with the ridiculous term limited omniscient. Yes, many writers still use this awful oxymoron, much to my chagrin. We're going to learn exactly why terminology like this irks me shortly, but I'm digressing. Anyway, I'd been in enough workshops to build up a decent tolerance to creative writers' awful terminology for talking about narrators. It's pretty standard. So I took Lucas's comment as what I thought was a very basic principle of writing, being reiterated in the same way a baseball coach might habitually say something fundamental like, "Keep your eye on the ball, kid." As Lucas uttered that seemingly basic proposition, I heard this colleague of mine gasp. During a break, she said something to me along the lines of, "I've never thought of that before. This whole time I was writing my novel, I never thought of who was telling the story because it was a third-person narrator." No lie. A very talented novelist, mind you. Now, I don't reiterate this to denigrate this colleague, because she's brilliant. I relate this to convey the current reality among writers, which is one of the things that baffles me the most about the predominant approach to teaching and learning creative writing. It's a crapshoot. You can major in creative writing, be in your third year of a prestigious MFA program, have taken countless literature and writing classes, be totally brilliant, and still have a eureka moment on an aspect of fiction writing as fundamental as, who is your narrator? That happens. As I write this lesson, I'm currently looking at a textbook. It's a creative writing textbook, very broadly used, written by an eminent writer and professor in a graduate-level creative writing program. And as much as I hate to be critical of others' hard work, the book just gets this wrong. Sorry, but it's wrong. Writers suck at talking about narrators, and it baffles me. Scholars in the early 20th century had better verbiage than most writers use today, and narrative theorists have had much better conceptions for decades. The essay from which I'll be drawing many of the concepts I'll share with you in this section was written by a French literary scholar named Gérard Genette in the 1980s. So why, oh why, then, do we writers still use such imprecise, confusing terminology? Honestly, I hate to say it, but I think it's laziness. I really do. I have to ask the question, do we writers sometimes use the intuitive approach as a cover to not get our hands dirty? To not do the hard work of learning our techniques through and through? A bit like a young poet, writing only in free verse because that meter thing is just so passé and unimaginative and restricting and, well, hard. This is a byproduct of jumping in the deep end of the pool and floundering around and skipping our lessons, because it's so much more fun to just write. That's my take, and I'm bringing the lessons, because it's about damn time. We're going to do the dirty work here, and in so doing, find out that it really isn't that hard at all. That Jeanette guy had it all figured out, and now you can too. And you'll sound like a genius in your next workshop. And you won't have to puzzle over the differences between types of narration any longer. We're going to cover them all, right here, right now. So let's begin. I have an uncle who's a poet, not at all like the poets I described above who read their obscure, puzzling, purportedly deep work and get all mad at you because you just don't get it, man. Not the kind who stands up at a family gathering or wedding and all the guests are like, "Oh, dear God, he wrote a poem. Oh." No, he's a good poet. The kind who wins awards and gets published in anthologies of poems with poets you've heard of. And many of his poems start with a voice, somebody talking. Very often it's an accent, a Maine lobsterman, a blue-collar New Yorker, a southern drawl, lilting in the breeze of an autumn day, with the green of the kudzu almost palpable in the air. And then this voice starts to tell a story, often beginning with an image, a memory, and a place. Sometimes it's a circumstance, like the kids going off to school in the fall or the first time the narrator's daughter saw a butterfly. But there's almost always a voice in his poetry. It's one of the things that makes him so good. And that's where we'll begin, with the voice. The narrator is one of the most important components of a written piece of fiction. A narrator is indispensable. This is the fictional teller of the tale, the speaker, so to speak. In my full-length definition of a story, I use the verbiage an interest-grabbing set of language-based instructions arranged in an order that cues the reader to simulate an approximate cognitive model. The language-based instructions are the words on the page, and the narrator is the hypothetical generator and organizer of those words. The narrator can adopt a theoretically infinite number of postures from which to tell their tale. Your narrator could be a godlike entity outside the story, a 10-year-old girl, a turtle, a tree, or in the case of one ingenious Italian short story writer, a subatomic particle, as some have argued, named QFWFQ, who exists outside time and space. This endless set of possibilities means the role of narrator can be complex, but fortunately for us, well studied. There are two basic common conceptions about the narrator, both misconceptions in my view. I'll show you why. The first misconception you might have heard talked about is the quote-unquote first-person narrator. I sat at the back of the room while the professor went on, yammering about this and that and blah blah blah. I was tired and hungover from the previous night's party, and I just wanted to crawl back into my bed. It should be obvious why people would call this narrator a first-person narrator, because this speaker is using first-person pronouns to convey the information. Good enough. The second misconception we've already heard about, the so-called third-person narrator. So-called because this narrator uses third-person pronouns to speak about the things happening in the story world, as such. The lecturer had short hair, a beard, and usually liked to sit when he taught. He talked constantly about theoretical conceptions that didn't make much difference in the real world. On this day, though, he stood, pacing back and forth like a prosecutor in front of a jury box. First person and third person are, of course, grammatical conceptions, not narrative postures. Writers, teachers, and laypeople often use this terminology because it's a prominent feature in the text. It's right there for you to notice, the low-hanging fruit. But it's also lazy, imprecise, and often misleading. To wit, the lecturer had short hair, a beard, and usually liked to sit when he taught. He talked constantly about theoretical concerns that didn't make much difference in the real world. On this day, though, he stood, pacing back and forth like a prosecutor in front of a jury box. I sat at the back of the room and yawned while the professor went on, yammering about this and that and blah blah blah. I was tired, hungover from the previous night's party, and I just wanted to crawl back into my bed. As you can see, a first-person narrator uses third-person pronouns too. The type of pronoun a narrator uses is a byproduct of their relationship to the story. The real distinction writers need to have mastery over is who the narrator is, not what pronouns they're using to convey the action in the story world. I like the terminology Jeanette uses here, narrative posture. It encompasses the fundamentally important elements of the narrator's relationship to the story. Instead of worrying about the pronouns, he simply asks the question, who speaks? This question encompasses a litany of other questions that allow us to nail down a more precise conception of who the narrator is. And it encodes implications the narrator's characteristics will have on the way your story is told. We can, and will, ask questions like, where is this narrator speaking from? Is the narrator male, female, other, neither? When is the narrator speaking? To whom? What does this narrator know? Is the narrator involved in the action? Is this narrator trustworthy? How do we know? Why would a writer adopt this narrative posture? What would the narrative look like from a different narrative posture? That's a lot of questions for one narrator, and all the answers to these important questions would be too much for the first-person, third-person binary to tell us much of anything. That's for the caveman writing class down the hall. If you'd like to visit, be sure to bring your crayons. It's really fun. I've been to a lot of them. For our purposes, though, we're going to examine all the important implications of these questions and, more importantly, how the narrator presents information to the reader via the string of words they set down on the page for the reader to pick up. Now, to be fair, Jeanette asked a lot of difficult questions about narrators, and he did it in French about a very complex novel by Marcel Proust. So all of Jeanette's commentary was translated from a very high academic style of French into high narrative geek in English, using a 4,000-page model that few English speakers have ever read. I don't blame my fellow writers for tapping out after about 5 pages of Jeanette, or even not opening the book for that matter. This is what people like Roe are here for. I'm even going to translate from high narrative geek into plain English. Narrative geeks would recognize the terminology for narrators under such monikers as heterodiegetic, autodiegetic, or homodiegetic. We writers need not get our hands that dirty. And fear not, if the nature of these narrative postures and their implications aren't immediately self-explanatory, we'll get into all those things as we go along. For now, we're going to begin by asking perhaps the single most important question about the narrator, as posed by another literary scholar, Wayne Booth, a couple decades before Jeanette. Is the narrator a character or not? Oh,